On a cold February night in 2003, inside the dim, echoing halls of his Pyrenees castle, Phil Spector stood over a silence so heavy it seemed to swallow the lights of Los Angeles below. Moments earlier, the music legend who built the Wall of Sound had been laughing, drinking, drifting between charm and danger, the same razor's edge he'd walked his entire life. Now, in that velvet-draped room, glamour curdled into something darker. A single gunshot had cracked the night open, and with it, the myth of the untouchable genius began to collapse. Behind the gold records, behind the symphonies that glowed like cathedrals, hid a man haunted by ghosts. His father's suicide, a lifetime of paranoia, and an obsession with control that only grew sharper with fame. How did the boy who worshipped sound become the man feared for his silence? And what secret darkness pushed him to the edge that night? This is the untold truth of Phil Spector. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Tentaons. At just 9 years old, Phil Spector watched his world rupture when his father, Ben, ended his life inside a 1940s Ford with carbon monoxide fumes. 4 years later, in 1953, his mother uprooted the family from the Bronx to Los Angeles, 2,800 miles away, hoping distance could dilute grief. Instead, the move only sharpened Phil's isolation. By age 17, he had withdrawn almost completely into music, spending hours in the recording labs at Fairfax High, studying tape machines and microphones, the way other boys studied sports. His first real step into Hollywood came in 1958. When he formed the Teddy Bears with two classmates. They rehearsed in a garage no larger than 120 square feet, stacking mattresses on the walls to mimic the echo chambers Phil idolized at Gold Star Studios. That same year, at just 19, he convinced Door Records to cut a single, an audacious attempt made with only $40 worth of rented studio time. The gamble worked. To know him is to love him. Titled after the 6 words carved on his father's tombstone, sold over 1 million copies, and hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in December 1958. But hidden beneath the triumph was the first fracture. The song that made him famous was born not from ambition, but from obsession, an attempt to rewrite his father's death into something beautiful. And as producers, managers, and industry veterans began praising his genius ear, they also fed a darker truth. Phil learned early that pain could be alchemized into power. In these early years, one choice quietly set the trajectory of his future: the decision to create alone. The studios, the equipment, even the musicians would eventually become extensions of his will. The seed of control had been planted, and Hollywood had no idea what it had just awakened. By the early 1960s, Phil Spector was no longer just a promising producer. He was a phenomenon. Between 1961 and 1966, he crafted more than 20 top 40 singles, with at least 6 entering the top 10. At age 21, while most producers were still apprenticing, Phil negotiated a 50% ownership stake in Phillies Records, giving him unprecedented control over budgets, masters, and artistic direction. In the summer of 1963, his Wall of Sound reached a commercial peak with Be My Baby, recorded using 17 musicians, 4 pianos, 3 basses, and multiple percussion layers stacked across 3 synchronized tape machines. The session cost nearly $15,000, an astronomical number for the era. But the result was undeniable. The single hit #2 on Billboard and sold over 2 million copies worldwide. From the outside, these were golden years. Inside, they were a tightening vice. Success made Phil believe he could bend time, people, even physics to his will. In 1964, he withdrew into Gold Star Studios for stretches of 14 hours a day, obsessively remixing tracks in windowless rooms where the temperature often rose above 90-degree Fahrenheit because he refused to stop sessions for ventilation. By 1965, he demanded orchestras of 30 to 40 musicians, even for simple pop arrangements. a logistical nightmare that doubled production costs but fed his growing fixation on sonic control. Yet, this ascent carried its first blind spot. Phil began pushing away collaborators who questioned him. In 1966, he spent more than $40,000 producing River Deep Mountain High for Ike and Tina Turner, equivalent to hundreds of thousands today. When the single stalled at EO 88 in the US, he interpreted it not as a market failure, but as a personal betrayal. For weeks, he shut himself inside his mansion, supposedly sleeping with the test pressing beneath his pillow, convinced the industry was conspiring against him. Then came the first prophecy moment. During a late-night session that same year, engineer Larry Levine recalled Phil staring at the studio speakers and muttering, almost to himself, "They'll love me when I'm gone, never while I'm alive." It was a throwaway line, but everyone in the room felt the temperature drop. The man who once sculpted sound like cathedrals now spoke as if he were building his own mausoleum. Meanwhile, the cracks deepened. Staff noticed his drinking intensifying. Assistants reported nights where Phil consumed an entire bottle of Cutty Sark during a mix and still insisted on driving home. Musicians whispered that he had begun bringing firearms into sessions. One member of the wrecking crew estimated that between 1965 and 1966, Phil brought a gun to the studio at least a dozen times, laying it on the console as casually as a cup of coffee. And through it all, he kept climbing higher. In 1970, he signed on to salvage the Beatles' Let It Be, working with 80-piece orchestral overdubs on The Long and Winding Road. 12 months later, he was co-producing George Harrison's All Things Must Pass, a triple album that sold over 7 million copies. To the world, he was unstoppable. But to those close enough to hear the trembling in his late-night monologues, the truth was already clear. Phil wasn't ascending. He was accelerating toward something he could no longer control. Tuah. By the early 1970s, the brilliance that once electrified Phil Spector's world began turning inward, cutting him from the inside. The psychological fractures seeded in childhood, his father's suicide at age 9, the uprooting across 2,800 miles, the years of emotional volatility, now returned with a force he could no longer drown out with orchestras or echo chambers. In 1973, during sessions with John Lennon for rock and roll, the old wounds resurfaced violently. Witnesses reported that Phil, drunk and jittering from prescription pills, fired a gun into the studio ceiling. Lennon later recalled that more than 20 people dove for cover. Phil laughed, then vanished with the tapes for months. Those closest to him noticed changes by the numbers. His drinking escalated from nightly glasses to bottles per session. His sleeping pills increased enough that staff whispered he could barely distinguish day from night. Between 1974 and 1977, he produced fewer than 5 major projects, a dramatic collapse for a man who once averaged multiple charting singles per year. And yet, whenever he did reappear in public, he seemed swollen with paranoia. He installed an estimated 30-plus surveillance cameras inside his mansion. He paid for armed patrols around the property. His security expenses alone reportedly climbed over $10,000 per month, an unsustainable burn rate even for someone with royalty checks still arriving from the 1960s. But the deepest collapse unfolded behind closed doors. His marriage to Ronnie Bennett, which officially ended in 1974, had been a psychological battlefield for years. Court documents from the divorce detailed Phil's escalating rages, the threats with guns, and the financial controls so tight that Ronnie claimed she was allowed only $14 a week to live on, despite being the voice behind million-selling hits. That humiliation combined with Phil's growing isolation formed a loop of self-destruction he could not escape. The house grew darker, the nights longer, and his dependency on mood-altering substances intensified. By the mid-1980s, he had withdrawn almost entirely from public life. Those who saw him described a man unrecognizable from the sharp-suited prodigy he once was. His weight fluctuated drastically. His drinking, by one friend's estimate, totaled half a bottle of scotch nightly. In 1984, a near-fatal car crash marked his first major physical collapse. Driving on Mulholland, he slammed his car into the median, suffering severe injuries to his head and scalp. It took over 300 stitches to repair the damage. For months afterward, he wore wigs pulled tight over the scars, not out of vanity, but because he feared the world would see how broken he'd become. The accident accelerated his downward spiral. Sessions that once lasted 14 hours were now replaced with days where he didn't leave his bedroom. Assistants found him surrounded by pill bottles, sedatives, antidepressants, antipsychotics, often mixed with alcohol. Medical notes from later proceedings revealed he had been treated for bipolar symptoms for 8 years, with mood swings described as severe and difficult to stabilize. His behavior turned more erratic, shouting at staff over misplaced objects, hallucinating noises in empty hallways, accusing friends of betrayal after not returning calls within minutes. And still, the past refused to stay buried. Women came forward with stories that mirrored each other with terrifying precision. Being locked inside his mansion, being shown the gun he carried tucked into his waistband, being told they weren't allowed to leave until he said so. One musician estimated that between 1988 and 2002, there were at least 20 incidents where Phil used alcohol and weapons to intimidate women who rejected or challenged him. Whether the exact figure is accurate or not, the pattern was unmistakable. A man collapsing under the weight of his own fear. Then came the night that would define everything. February 3rd, 2003. At Once I Phil met actress Lana Clarkson at the House of Blues. She had been working a shift that paid roughly $9 an hour. By 5:08 a.m., she lay slumped in a chair inside his Pyrenees castle. A .38 caliber gunshot wound through her mouth, teeth shattered across the carpet. When his trembling chauffeur, Adriano de Souza, approached the doorway, Phil stepped outside holding the gun and said the sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I think I killed somebody." The investigation that followed ripped open everything he'd spent decades hiding. Toxicology reports cited alcohol in his system. Witness testimony detailed years of weapons, threats, and substance-fueled rages. In 2009, after a second trial and more than 120 witnesses, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life. The collapse was complete. The boy who once rewrote grief into music had become a prisoner of the trauma he never outran. Every echo he had built, every wall of sound, now came back to crush him. To Ziu. In the years after his conviction in 2009, Phil Spector's world shrank to a cell measuring barely 7 by 11 feet inside the California Substance Abuse Treatment Facility. For a man who once commanded orchestras of 40 musicians, the silence was unbearable. Yet within those walls, he attempted one final act of reinvention. He wrote letters to friends describing plans for a comeback album, insisting he still had 3 symphonies left in him. Nothing came of it. His health deteriorated rapidly. By 2014, medical reports noted complications from his long-term bipolar treatment. By 2015, he required full-time care due to severe hearing loss and neurological decline. The wigs that once hid his scars now hid the frailty of a man aging faster than the calendar. His last public photograph, taken in 2015, showed him weighing nearly 40 pounds less than during his trial, a hollowed silhouette of the figure who once ruled American pop. When he died in January 2021 at age 81, the cause listed was COVID-19 complications layered on years of physical deterioration. And so his story closes not with applause, but with a question that refuses to fade. Was Phil Spector destroyed by Hollywood? By the ghosts of his childhood, or by the very genius that once made him unstoppable? This is the legacy he leaves behind, a masterpiece fractured by its own creator.